Hello, students. Today I want to talk about housing, and along with that, I'll mention some of the social issues that are related to housing, because I think a discussion of housing leads into a discussion of social issues. So I'm James Vaughn. I've been kind of away for a while. I had COVID, and now I'm back, and so I'm going to have some video lectures for you to view. Well, first of all, let's determine just what housing is. And I think you can easily break it down into two categories, the use value and the exchange value. So use value is basic need. It's a shelter, quality of life, whether it be the little shack with the front porch in the upper right or the Italianate manse in the middle. Regardless, it can be home sweet home. So the use value is related to the fact that it shelters you and you need it, and it does reflect or relate to your quality of life. It's also a reflection of the society's values, the culture, the material culture that you see, especially in America. I think you see housing used as a statement of how important or how wealthy or whatever someone is. And also, it is a reflection of the technology of the times. And so, more technology is installed in the newer houses, and houses do become dated and uh, functionally obsolete because of this. And if the house is in a neighborhood that has appreciated in value or that is being gentrified, then you might go in and renovate it and install some of that newer technology. It's also the largest single expenditure for most Americans. And so, as such, we are very emotionally attached to this structure. Uh, since many of the people who have houses have 30-year mortgages, and so it's quite a commitment to buy and own a house and keep it up and everything. And so you do get very protective of that investment. And if you go to housing meetings or planning and zoning committee meetings where they're talking about a neighborhood or changing the zoning, you will see people get very, very emotional. It's also a reflection of the individual's status or personality or their satisfaction with life in general. Some people feel the need to have a big mansion kind of structure with a grand entrance that makes the visitor feel small compared to the grandiosity of the person living in this house. I think you can kind of see that in this middle image here. That entryway is pretty amazing there. And a lot of us, look at housing as a reflection of our status in society. And that's why, if you notice, you'll see billboards up and down the freeways that advertise neighborhoods being from $300,000 to $400,000 or whatever. And so your status is defined by the value of the house that you can afford. Or even if you can't afford it, you might go for it anyway. So the other kind of use, or the other kind of definition, looks at exchange value or equity. And so, equity is something that a lot of people think is going to be automatic. If the property values keep going up, then they think they're building equity. So what is equity? Okay, quick example. You pay $100,000 for a house, and you get a loan for $80,000. And so your equity is $20,000. So theoretically, if you sold it for what you paid for it, you'd get your $20,000 back. So that's called equity. Now, if the value of the house goes up after a year to $120,000, your equity is doubled to $40,000, and that is what a lot of people expect to happen. However, on occasion, like in 2008 and 1985 in Texas, that housing value will not go up, it will go down. And your equity can disappear. So if you paid $100,000 for the house and a year or two later there's been a housing burst, the bubble has burst, it may be worth $80,000 in which you have zero equity. or as happened in a lot of cases, it could have gone below $80,000, in which case you owe more on the house than you can actually sell it for. Well, you've probably heard the term housing tenure. Tenure simply means the type of ownership. Do you rent or do you own? And the census will always ask this question in their housing surveys because the percentage of owner occupancy is considered to be good, good for the economy, and so on and so forth. And generally, tenancy is related to more affordable housing or lower income types and things like that. So tenure is simply whether it's owner occupied or whether it's rented. And a house can be alienated, which means you can get it away from you. This is called conveyance, and it's conveyed by the market pricing mechanisms generally. And so the market sets the cost of occupancy. And, a legitimate sale is considered one with a knowledgeable buyer paying a fair price and the seller being satisfied with the price that he or she recovers. So the market value is very, very important. It's what the appraisal districts in the United States use to set the value that you're assessed on for property taxes. Now, the outside market does influence the value of that property. And generally, it's a government entity, generally a local government entity. And that can affect the cost of occupancy. And that can be drainage regulations or street requirements, lot size, all sorts of things, presumably for the benefit of the public health, safety, and welfare, which is why we do planning, and to avoid some of the more egregious developer misbehaviors from the past where they wouldn't provide roads that were any good and the piping would break down after 2 or 3 years because it was cheap plastic or what have you. So there are things that affect the price, based on regulations. So housing is a commodity. There's a supply and a demand, obviously, if you look at Eco 101. But the supply is really not as straightforward as it could be. It's complicated by the production methodology and technology that's used. So at one point, you'd build a house one at a time. Nowadays, they're kind of built Fordist style, almost assembly line, or at least the earlier days of suburbanization, like Levittown in Long Island, up in New York. You'd have a slab crew come in, and you'd have a framing crew, the roofing crew, and so they would just pop up these houses pretty quickly. Now, I guess if you go to buy a house, they're still kind of mass produced, but the standardized floor plans, you generally get quite a selection of them, and you can add in a lot of things. This is a standardized housing floor plan from about 1932, I would guess. A nice craftsman house, simple plan, minimalist design, and it's something that a lot of people really appreciate nowadays, that we have these big monster houses. Now the house is going to require extensive site preparation, either to level the land or to bring in roads and infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, it's pretty obvious in this country we have an oversupply for the rich and we have an undersupply for the poor. Just, most builders would rather, build a big house. You have a higher profit margin than you do a smaller, cheaper house. But anyway, housing costs, if they go above 1/3 or more of your household income, you are considered housing poor. In other words, you're spending too much on housing, and you shouldn't have to spend more than 1/3. This is very problematic in some places, like San Francisco or Boston or Los Angeles, because even if you have a lot of money, a small old craftsman style home in parts of Los Angeles costs $1 million or $2 million. The housing prices are just so excessive. Housing issues. Well, political feasibility. It is politically very difficult to provide affordable housing or alternative housing, such as halfway houses or even apartments. It's because politically you're going to get voted in by those homeowners who get very emotional about the ownership of their home and don't want any kind of change coming in. They don't want any disturbance. And so politically, they're very powerful and and they vote. And so it's very, very difficult to uh, get around this kind of exclusionary zoning that happens in most towns. And what that means is you use zoning to preclude certain styles of housing, less expensive housing, and in some cases, you're just trying to preclude persons of color or persons of low income. And so you're using zoning not for the public health, safety, and welfare or the standards, keep up the standards for the roads and the houses. You're using it to exclude undesirable types. And so if you spend a few seconds looking at this, looking at my images here, you might get a chuckle. If you don't already live here, you probably can't afford to. Now, that's not a real sign, but I think a lot of towns would like to have a sign like that. Lending discrimination has been rampant in this country up until the civil rights laws of the 60s that LBJ managed to get through the Congress back in the day when you could actually get something passed. And the most notorious was redlining, and this was from the 1930s to the 70s. And this begins with the era when we're, as a government, trying to use housing to, uh, get the economy rolling again. So Hoover, actually, before Roosevelt, felt that if we could get everybody buying a house and then buying stuff to go in the house, that would really get the economy off the schneid, and we'd be in great shape. But the agency set up to make it easier to buy houses would not loan in what were called non-homogeneous neighborhoods. Homogeneous meant not white. Okay, and so they would literally, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a quasi governmental entity, would draw a red line around neighborhoods that they would not guarantee a loan in. And so the banks and the mortgage companies wouldn't want to loan there because they wouldn't be propped up by the HOLC and later on the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration. So lenders like doing business with them because if the or if the owner gives up on the house later, then the government is on the hook and not the mortgage company for the amount of money that they might lose. Predatory lending, we saw a lot of this in the late 90s and 2000s with the subprime lending disasters. Banks were offering loans to risky applicants, and they, got high fees, and the interest rates were higher than normal. This was to compensate for the higher risk. So the salesmen for these companies were all about it. They loved it because they would get big fat commissions, and people who probably shouldn't be owning a house either because they're just not ready financially to own a house would be stuck with a loan that generally went up every year. The monthly payment went up, and eventually they found that they couldn't afford it, and so they would have the house foreclosed, or they would walk away from the house, or whatever. Generally, they ended up, owing more than the house could be sold for. So yeah, this is kind of a funny little cartoon, I think, um, and leads into a discussion of gentrification, but it's pretty typical of what the housing pattern has been for the last 80 or so years. And if you know about Burgess's concentric zone theory and invasion and succession, where the wealthy people start out in the center of town and then they move to the first ring of suburbs and then they hop to the second ring of suburbs, and so the immigrants come in and take the older houses that they had, and so on and so forth. So you have this kind of constant process of invasion and succession. So I think this is pretty true and does a little bit to explain what gentrification is. So the whites live in the cities, the crowning glory of civilization. The minorities move into the cities, and the whites go, oh, they're not like us, so goodbye. And then you have white flight, and they flee to the suburbs. Ah, this is better. And then the whites move into a second ring suburbs, so they get bigger houses. They make, they're making more money. They're in their prime money making age group. And so the cities suck. We want to get out of them. They're dead, and they are suffering because they're losing their tax base and everything. So there was a period in this country where the downtown areas were really in trouble. Then the minorities move into the first ring suburbs where the white people lived, and then say this is better, I guess. And then the white people move back into the center of the city, gentrification, and says, "Ha ha, it worked." And so this I think does kind of humorously reflect what's really going on, especially when you start talking about gentrification. So private communities are another issue with housing. I don't know if you've heard of HOAs or homeowners associations, but a lot of people have very, very poor opinions of these groups. But generally, they're set there for keeping the housing expensive. Big lots and stone facades, and you have to have St. Augustine grass and all this other stuff. So generally, if you buy into a neighborhood with a homeowner association, most people understand that and are willing to participate, but they can get kind of fascist, if you paint your house the wrong color or whatever. And generally, master plan communities do have HOAs. Master plan communities being those that are planned by a big developer all at once. They're not just building houses on a street and then continuing on the next street. They plan this whole little town out and then develop it, and it can take 20 or 30 years to build it out. So the build out time period can be quite long. Some of these places are gated, which reflects on the increasing paranoia of successful people. One pundit calls this the secession of the successful, which I would agree the Dominion does pretty much represent such a place. It also results in every neighborhood or small town or grouping of neighborhoods wanting to be their own town and not be part of the big, evil, crime-ridden city. And this is balkanization. It's a geographic term taken from what happened to Yugoslavia after World War II, and it was balkanized into 7 or 8 different smaller countries. Well, if you look at the Austin-San Antonio corridor, you might think of Austin and New Braunfels and San Marcos and San Antonio, but there are 92 separate incorporated municipalities. Hell, San Antonio has, Alamo Heights and Terrell Hills and other towns within it. And this is just a result of people wanting to control their housing values, really, and results in a lot of little municipal governments, each kind of contending with one another. Homelessness is a result of not having adequate housing for people who are down on their luck. A lot of people might think it's related to mental illness, and in some cases it is, in which case the issue would be patients' rights. Some is related to drugs and alcohol, but a lot of it is just economic, where you got kicked out of your house because you couldn't make the payment and you can't afford to live anywhere. You don't have any money. So poverty and housing costs are so high. And maybe your personal character has something to do with it. I don't know. Urban renewal caused a lot of homelessness. This was something that the federal government enabled with funds for cities to tear down entire neighborhoods to build things like the Hemisphere in San Antonio. And so, or Chavez Ravine, the Los Angeles Dodgers Stadium. So they would, take a neighborhood that they called blighted, BLIGHTED, And the definition of blighted was it wasn't, quote, homogeneous. It had a lot of people of color, or the incomes were lower, or whatever. It might have been a perfectly viable neighborhood with people who liked their neighbors, but it didn't fit the definition of, a solid neighborhood based on income. And so the government would get involved in tearing these places down and building freeways or hotel complexes, or as I said, the Hemisphere back in the 60s was a result of that. You used to have SROs, or single residence occupancy places, or flop houses. We don't have those anymore. People don't like those in their neighborhood for sure. We used to have, garage apartments or small houses attached to the back of a house for mother-in-law cottage or what have you. We don't have those anymore because zoning prohibits it, and the neighbors get all upset if you want to, build a little structure in the back of your house for your mother or what have you. So all of these are issues related to housing that, could be debated and discussed quite a bit. Catastrophes impact housing, of course. We saw that in Houston with all the flooding, but Katrina is always a great case study, and it obviously impacted the poor more. And if you look at New Orleans, if you look at any city for that matter, the poor generally live on the lower elevations, and the wealthier people live in higher elevations. Alamo Heights, okay, if you look at a topographical map of San Antonio, Alamo Heights is a high point, elevation-wise, in San Antonio. Shaker Heights outside of Cleveland. And the examples are numerous, okay? So the poor people were impacted, and rebuilding was a problem because a lot of neoliberal developers, or developers working with city officials, would say, well, let's rebuild this, but let's rebuild it for higher income types or whatever. Let's replace these little stick-built 2-bedroom, 1-bath houses with big vacation homes. I think later on we're going to talk a little bit more about economic development, but that is also related to housing and all the issues that we've been talking about. So you generally have incentives and subsidies for big business to move into an area and to open up their business. And quite often you will use eminent domain or the power of the government to take property for public benefit. Now, the definition of public benefit is all over the place, but it can be abused where you, again, take decent neighborhoods that might not be high income and condemn them to build hotels, like you see here in this picture of San Antonio, or, as I said earlier, the Hemisphere Park. You have transportation planning, which is also affects housing, and it affects it in different ways depending upon the value of the housing. So if you look at Highway 281 that goes from the airport down south of town, you'll notice it takes these painful bends around Olmos Park and the very high dollar neighborhoods there around Trinity University. And then once it gets past all that, it just cuts straight through the middle income neighborhoods south of town, where South Cross is, for example. So that's a very visible illustration of transportation planning and how it affects the environment based on the value of the housing that we're looking at. Economic development is also a kind of a form of covert discrimination, especially in this neoliberal era where deep-pocketed private interests get together with powerful government interests and either use eminent domain or other more subtle, indirect ways of getting people of low income to move out of an area to make room for some fabulous casino or other income generating facility. And so, for example, this small house on the lower left would probably have some trouble, or maybe getting a permit to rebuild and because the powers that be would prefer that that disappear and be replaced by this grand casino here that you see uh, located in, I believe that's Biloxi. So post Katrina to the east of New Orleans, you had a lot of this kind of thing going on. Gulfport and Biloxi, and some uh, person was actually quoted as saying that the results of Katrina was a fortuitous blank slate for rapid and sweeping gentrification and redevelopment. And so you keep the diversity in a certain place, and below I-10 in this particular example, if you're familiar with how I-10 runs east and west in lower parts of Mississippi and Alabama. Okay, so I just want you to think about change, and are things changing? I think things won't change until we change ourselves. Uh, you know, This is a quote from Chief Justice Roberts in 2013 when they were debating whether to gut the Civil Rights Act, Voting Act. And he said, well, it's 50 years later, talking about Birmingham, Alabama, and all the other southern towns that had these racial meetups between the residents and the cops. And have they changed, though? I mean, that's the question. And I just bring this up because housing is a reflection of our culture, and it reflects some things that are immutably unchanging. It seems like. So I don't think things have changed that much. And Judge Roberts is wrong. So if you look at Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, and you look at Ferguson, Missouri, 2014, even the visuals and the poses of the cops and the victims or the protesters are very similar. Or you look at this picture. Um, this is Ferguson, and you have your little lineup of cops, and then over there in Birmingham, Alabama, you have your cops with their guns and their khaki pants and their cool hats and stuff like that. So this all just plays into housing, which is a very representative issue uh, in urban power politics and planning. Okay. And it leads into other issues that have a housing connection, such as environmental injustice, environmental racism. Why do the poor disproportionately live near landfills or polluting industries? That's a topic for a whole nother lecture. Gender issues. Well, I think women started thinking about, or feminists started thinking about this as a result of being imprisoned in the suburbs in the 50s and the 60s. This was supposed to be the American dream, and yet they were left out there, uh, you know, on their own uh, with nothing to do. A lot of them didn't have a second car, and you couldn't walk anywhere because these places were so spread out. Or gay rights, aging, different housing. So generally, you can't age in place in this country. And that's because of the way the developers build our housing subdivisions. Instead of having a variety of housing types and costs, you have one style, big McMansion, $400,000, $500,000. And so if you age there and your kids move and your income maybe goes down, you have to move out of your neighborhood that you may have been in for 30 or 40 years. This is wrong. Why not build a variety of housing types and prices in one neighborhood? Just keep them all stylish or whatever, so people won't have a connection fit about lower income housing ruining their property values or whatever. But there's so much that stems from housing, especially uh, you know in this country, and it's been going on forever. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a trip through housing in America over the years and some of the issues that are there. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.